For those of you tuning in, my name is Ryan Hayes. I'm a local lender here in Greensboro. I focus on residential investment and refinance properties. The topic of today is short-term rentals and what is going to be rolling out on 4/1 specific to the city of Greensboro. So for those of you who are real estate agents, investors, if you reside in Greensboro, it's a very important topic for you to know and understand when it comes to property use for you and your fellow neighbors.
My name is Mike Kirkman. I'm the zoning administrator for the city of Greensboro. So my role in this conversation is I am over both the administration of the ordinance and how these rules are applied, and then also the enforcement of these rules. All the zoning enforcement functions work with my division. So one of the things I also wanted to make sure folks were aware of is that these rules only apply to properties that are located in the city of Greensboro's jurisdiction. So if you have a property that's located in Gilbert County, if you have a property that's in Summerfield, Pleasant Garden, High Point, these rules do not apply. So if you have questions about those, you need to go to those jurisdictions and ask those questions.
Perfect. Just baseline, what enforcement is currently in place right now for a short-term rental, and what is a short-term rental by definition?
Right. So our ordinance right now actually refers to a short-term rental as a tourist home, bed and breakfast. That's the terminology that's used right now. That language was really designed for your classic tourist home where you have the retired couple that lives out in the accessory dwelling unit and then provides breakfast to everybody every day. Very much a commercial activity on there. And part of the reason that that is the way it is, our ordinance talks about if you have single-family residential zoning, you would have to get a special use permit to allow that rental use on there. And there are other standards about the owner of the property having to reside there and other standards with that. Those standards really don't work with what is now a short-term rental,
right.
This Airbnb, VRBO market on here. So we worked with a group of stakeholders, community group, for probably about 6 months. Kind of evaluated other people's ordinances, try to understand what their priorities were for Greensboro, and then put together this other ordinance. And the big thing right off the bat is we actually have a definition now of what a short-term rental is. I think that's important for everybody to understand that a short-term rental is renting of residential property for 30 days or less.
Yep.
So if you are renting properties for more than 30 days, that does not fall under these provisions. And I think that's where some confusion is right now about what does really qualify as that. Within the short-term rentals, we break it out a little bit further. There is a term called a homestay rental, and then basically that's where you're going to rent a couple of rooms in your house, and you're there while that rental's going on. And we have what's called a whole house rental. And the whole house rental is really where a lot of people are asking the questions about, and that's where you rent out the entire dwelling on there, and you're not there necessarily during the rental period.
Yeah, and I know you guys have third-party folks that are helping you identify, locate, because we'll talk about how the location matters in a minute. But how many of those do you think are whole house versus the alternative?
We are still getting final numbers together. Some initial estimates we got that it looks like there's around 800 or so individual properties in Greensboro right now that are being used in some capacity as a short-term rental, or at least being advertised for that purpose on there. The rough breakdown is about 80 to 85% are whole house rentals, and then what would be the homestay are really the smaller 15% or so on there. So definitely most of the folks are looking to do the whole house.
Yeah, for sure. And I know you don't have a heat map yet, but if we were to say, is a majority of that concentrated downtown, outliers, or a good mix?
Actually a good mix. Again, they're still in the process of verifying some of the addresses on there, so we don't have a full picture, but at least what we were looking at this week from our vendor is that it's spread pretty evenly throughout the city. I mean, obviously there's a good bit of demand in our in-town neighborhoods, because you're so close to the downtown area, to our universities, to some of the major venues on there with that. But there's enough demand, it seems, out there that this is something kind of throughout the region.
Oh, for sure, for sure. Currently, are there any regulations today on short-term rentals in Greensboro?
We are still using the tourist home regulations right now, because those are the ones that are on the books. The new regulations will go into effect on April 1st of this year, so a couple months from now with that. So we're in this a little bit weird in-between thing where we're using the rules we've had for a long time, but we know we have new rules coming, and those new rules are going to be different than the current rules on there. So we're still trying to navigate and at least make sure that we are still enforcing the rules we have, but know that we're going to have new rules here soon.
Right. So the new rules are going to limit the amount of Airbnbs, VRBOs, short-term rentals that we can have in Greensboro. Tell us, one, if you want to do it, how do you apply to being it, existing, and potentially new?
Right. So the way our ordinance is set up, we are regulating the use of property. Mm-hmm. So the short-term rental is a defined use. So we're going to require anybody that wants to do a short-term rental to get a zoning permit for them to be able to use that use of that property. In applying for that permit, one of the standards we have are some separation requirements between properties. So if you have a single-family residence, for instance, under the new rules, you would have to be separated by at least 750 feet from another short-term rental. And that is measured from property line to property line. Mm-hmm. So you would go to the edge of the property that you're interested in, measure out circumference 750 feet, and then see if it touches any other properties that have that on there. Separately, if you have a rental in a multifamily scenario, might be an apartment building, townhouses that are connected to each other, something like that, that standard is basically either 25% of the total number of units in there, or 1 unit, whichever is less. Mm-hmm. So basically, if you have more than 4 units in a building, you could have an additional short-term rental based on that ratio with that. But if you have less than that, you can get at least 1. So there is some desire of City Council to limit the total number in any specific area with that.
Yeah. So I know when we first spoke, we talked about density, and one of my questions was, especially in the downtown area, because we have tons of folks coming in. You've got Tanger, you've got the giant swim team or swim competition at GAC that happens every single year. There's a lot of attractions.
Festival,
exactly.
Homecoming, there's lots of different events,
tons that are just pouring people into the city. My question to you is about density. So the 25% gives a little bit of buffer from a density perspective, because a lot of these buildings could go up or they could be connected.
Correct.
So the 25% definitely helps from a downtown perspective.
Now, one thing I will add that we've had to make a determination, one of the challenges we've had all along is we didn't know how many short-term rentals we already had in Greensboro and where they were located. So when we talked about these standards and other things on there, we didn't have a big clear picture. We're going to have that soon. We have made the determination, and I say we, the city, and working with our legal staff and manager's office on there, that if a short-term rental existed between January 1st, 2023 and December 31st, 2023, when they go to get their zoning permit, if they can provide evidence of it being in operation, so that would be showing listings, maybe having a rental contract that shows 30 days or less, showing occupancy tax paid for short-term rental at location, all those kind of things on there, they will be granted non-conforming status, which means effectively that the new rules will not apply to them at that point in time, and it would only be if they have to get a new permit down the road or there's some other issue on there that they would have to meet those new rules. So we know that there's a lot out there right now. And we want to try and be fair and equitable. There's a lot of competing interests, as you know, with this conversation on there. And so that's at least one of the things where we've decided that it makes sense to do, is to allow folks to say, hey, I've been in existence. We hope that means also that I haven't been causing problems to my neighbors, and they say that on there, and therefore we would grant you rights to continue as you're currently configured.
For sure. Their current Airbnb listing, their taxes that they might file, bank accounts that show the statement deposit from Airbnb, those would all be things that would consider them grandfathered essentially if they can show that in 2023.
Correct. Right.
Let's say that I have a property that I live in currently that I want to become an STR. I know that there's nobody around me within 750 feet that I believe that operates. How do I go about that? The permitting process looks like what?
Right, so we don't have it fully developed yet. We're working with our vendor on that, but the game plan is for it to be an online platform. So basically you would go to a website or get a link, be able to provide your documents online. There'll be a form you'll have to fill out and give us information, who owns the property, who's going to manage the property, those kinds of things on there, and provide those additional documents, pay your fee, which is still to be determined. We haven't had that figured out either. And then the city staff would review that to make sure that we don't see any issues with the permit, and then issue a certificate, basically a permit on there. And then our ordinance requires you that once you get that permit, that then you have to put that up in your unit so people know that the city has reviewed this as being a legal unit on there. And also, if you have advertisements on Airbnb or VRBO or other platforms, you would have, a PDF or some other image you can put up there and say, hey, this one is certified and has been reviewed by the city.
The only thing that I would ask Does that have owner's information on it? Like, would it have?
It would have property ownership information on there. Sometimes the owners are going to be the operators,
Right.
not all the time. And then basically what the city is trying to get to is we want to make sure there's a responsible party, that if there's an issue out there, we have somebody we can go to quickly
Right.
to try to resolve those issues on there. Because that's part of being a good neighbor, basically,
100%.
right?
Yep.
And you know, I say this a lot, zoning regulates use, it does not regulate behavior. So we understand that, you know, the use may be good, but you may have somebody that comes and stays that does
Right.
not behave themselves. And there are things where
Intention versus action.
exactly,
Right?
and you know, if people are out yelling and screaming late at night, other things, you know, we have noise ordinances and other things. Police can come out there and address that if they need to. But our idea, at least, was to make sure we had a responsible party that they could be that first point of contact.
For sure,
Because
for
sometimes it can say, hey, look, I got a complaint from your neighbor. Can you guys take it inside, turn it down? And people will do that
Right.
there. So if you have an operator, we'll call it local operators, the name in the term in the ordinance, that operator has to be located either within Guilford County or in a county that's adjacent to Guilford County.
Okay.
So that would be like Davie and Forsyth and
Okay.
Alamance, you know, Randolph, etc. And the idea basically is that they're within a short enough distance that if they had to physically go to the unit, they would only be maybe 30 to 40 minutes
For
away
sure.
at most on
For
there
sure.
with that.
So let's say hypothetically you have an owner that lives in Wilmington
Mm-hmm.
and they are the emergency contact. At that point, they would probably need to hire a property manager that's in Guilford and or adjacent
Correct.
counties?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So we
Okay.
wouldn't. That's the idea that, you know, we realize good intentions, but you're not able to get there if there is something you physically need to be there.
For
There's
sure.
no way to get there in time
Yeah,
to do
absolutely.
that. And so yeah, they would basically hire a local operator, and then that person would provide their contact information to us. Our system is going to be set up so basically there will be kind of a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week hotline, if you will, that folks can call in, get information about the short-term rental, and then if they have a complaint to file that, and then the operator or vendor can then just contact that person and say, okay, hey, we got a complaint about, let's say, noise. It's 1 o'clock in the morning on Saturday morning. I am not out looking for these things at that point in time. But they'll be able to take the complaint in, try to contact the operator to address that issue. If the operator addresses it, you know, they'll keep a track of that. And then when I'm back in the office Monday morning, I can pull up on the dashboard and say, okay, these things happened over the weekend. Do we need to do follow-up from an
Right.
enforcement standpoint or not? Are there other things we need to do on that? And I think that's the key here is that, you know, we're trying to balance the rights of private property owners who are looking to generate income for good reasons in some cases. I mean, you have an older home, the kids have moved out, you're looking for income to be able to maintain that home and that property, which is a good thing from a neighborhood perspective. You like to travel, you want a little extra money for those weekend vacation trips, those kind of things on there. But balance that with a level of activity that does not create disruptions to that existing neighborhood.
Right.
That's where those balances are. If the situation continues, then basically we will move to civil penalties. Civil penalties are escalating, so you start at $50 and you work your way up to $500.
Daily, monthly.
They can be, the way our ordinance is written, you can actually issue penalties daily. Now, we typically will allow a little bit of time to correct a violation, so I won't say immediately we'll go straight to 500 in that first week on there. Unless there's a public safety issue of some sort. If we feel like there's really an issue that this is creating public hazards, then we'll jump straight into those higher
Okay.
penalties on there. But the idea is that each time the violation still exists, you go to a higher penalty.
Consider it a contribution to the city.
Right. But yeah, it'll escalate. And then, you know, the city at the same time will also, if penalties are not working, then other things we'll look at is potentially going to court and filing some kind of injunction against that
Right.
property and saying basically, you know, we've tried this remedy, they're not cooperating, judge, you need to tell them they need to stop and,
Right.
and give us the authority to kind of shut it down that way. Separately from that, you know, there may be other things that go on. If the house is not being maintained appropriately, and that happens sometimes, people will post about, hey, you know, their plumbing's backed up and other things. We have minimum housing enforcement can go in there and
Right.
address those based on that information. Again, we have a noise ordinance so that if it's generating a lot of noise, especially late at night, police can come out there and address those issues. So there are other things besides these regulations that may come into play.
Right. So I was going to ask about parking noise, nuisances, but obviously it would be police first,
Mhm.
and then it would be the emergency contact or owner that's on the property.
Right.
Located in Guilford and or adjoining counties.
Correct.
Right? Got to keep repeating that because I do think that that's very important for property management companies. because it is going to be a change for some folks that utilize, their own internal resources, and they might be located elsewhere.
Right, and I think this is something we're seeing here and elsewhere, that this is kind of a little niche for certain folks and certain groups, that they say, okay, look, I will do this for you and manage your properties. So it's either a step above just general management of the property, or it's something that I'm just going to do this particular piece for you.
Right. So far, if I own and have operated a short-term rental in 2023 and I can prove that, I'm grandfathered. If I would like to start a business, owning a property and renting that out, I permit.
Well, you have to get a permit in either case.
How much of a time frame do we need for existing properties? Do those owners do they need to file immediately on April 1st, or is there a time frame? Because obviously you're going to get an influx of applications. And those that have been operating in good standard, is there a sense of urgency to overflow your office with those? Is there going to be a tiered approach to this?
I don't know the best advice there. I think realistically, the new rules go into effect April 1st. So on the flip side, we're also going to start getting complaints April 2nd about somebody's got there, and we're going to start enforcing that. So in some ways, it would be better to at least go ahead and have applications in, because we could say, hey, look, yes, okay, we do know there's a short-term rental, there's an application here under review. Let's review this first and make sure what rules apply, and then we'll know how to enforce that property on there. We're going to see how quickly we can put everything together. We might try to do, a little bit ahead of the April 1st deadline if we can have everything set up to take some pressure off of there. I can't guarantee that's what we're going to have on this. April 1st is definitely a hard deadline, that we have to have everything up and running and make sure it's working appropriately. We're going to make sure our vendor has a system that doesn't crash, because 300 people are trying to apply at the same time on there too. So it'll be a work in progress still. I wish we had everything to point to and say, hey, just go to the site right now and you can. I will say for folks that want to get more information, the website is greensboro-nc.gov/short-term rentals.
Perfect. So I mentioned at the very beginning, I'm a lender. I focus on residential, investment, refinance, but from an investment perspective, there are real estate agents out there that have clients that want to buy these homes. Let's say hypothetically, the property that they see appears as though it would be an investment property, and they could short-term rent this because based off of the regulations that are in place, maybe the density we're less than 25% of the building, so we know that one more unit can go, or we're 800 feet away from another property. We talked about there being an application process, and there's going to be a queue there because you don't have a staff of 1,000 that can process in 5 minutes. If I go under contract, then if I put due diligence money down, and if somebody comes in before me and has an application already in queue, it's going to leave agent, lender, buyer relatively limbo in that process. How do we know who's applied? So meaning if I live at 123 Main, do I know that there's an application for 126 Main? Is it going to be in a pending status that an agent could call and say, hey, help me understand? It looks good on the website, but is there anything processing?
Well, we're going to try and have a public viewer for ones that are permitted first off. So that'll at least help you understand that I'm looking at this property, let me find out what other dots are on the map, and I can roughly figure out that question. As far as pending applications go, you'll probably have to contact us and just ask if there are other ones in there. A pending application doesn't mean it's approved, so it's kind of hard to say, yes, they have rights, or no, they don't have rights. On the flip side, it's probably going to be a first come, first serve, where if somebody has filed their zoning permit, has paid their fee, has provided their documents on there at 127 on April 3rd, we got to look at that one first because that one came in first, and then the one that came in at 247, we're going to look at that one once we deal with this one on there with that. One of the things I will say at the end of the day, we know there's going to be properties that are not going to meet that separation standard. Another option that folks will have is they can go to our Board of Adjustment and request a variance from that standard. Now, variances are based to some degree on the hardships, unique circumstances, and other things on there. So this is not just I just want it to happen. You have to actually present information on why, yes, I'm within 700 feet of this unit, but they're across Wendover Avenue and there's no relationship. Those kind of conversations have to be had with the Board of Adjustment. But it does provide an opportunity, at least, if folks want to pursue that way, they have that opportunity. It's a public hearing, there's a public conversation with that on there.
Neighbors will show up.
could show up, yep. But
Yeah.
it's evidentiary based, so you have
Right.
to provide information. So it's not that a neighbor can come up and say, you know, I hate short-term rentals, they're the evil, or whatever. They have to say, okay, at this location, this is an issue because of these facts
Right.
on there. So at least it's not like a zoning hearing where people just kind of say whatever they feel like saying, and there's consideration. It's narrow to some degree on how you do that. But it is an option, and we anticipate folks will at least petition and go through that option as part of that conversation on there. But the reality is, like with any other permit we have with the city, I mean, we do separation requirements for family care homes, for instance,
Right.
on there, and we have what's called a reservation letter, and so folks will come in and apply, effectively lock that address up, then they'll finish going through the state process and other things on there with that, but it does create those rights once that letter is issued on there.
Right.
So if a permit's issued, it creates the rights for that property.
Okay, and with sale, does that permit transfer?
Yes, we were talking about this. I would
Yes.
check with our legal staff to make sure that we were good on this, but yeah, so again, we're regulating the use of property.
Right.
So we're not as concerned about who owns the property, other than the question about the operator.
Right,
About
right.
somebody being a good point of contact on there. But yeah, so if the property transfers ownership, if the operator changes information, that by itself, as we're looking at this point, would not revoke the permit per se. It would
Got
carry
it.
forward on there with that. We will have to look at that a little bit. When you get a non-conforming use, the rights stay there, but then you have to say at what point does it have to come into conformance, and there are
Right.
certain triggers under the ordinances that do that on
Right.
there. So we have to look at that question. Most of the issues are going to be people are not doing what they're supposed to do. We have to revoke the permit,
Right,
and then that
right.
would trigger you have to meet the new standards on there with that. But if you're operating, without causing issues, and like I said, many of these properties are doing that now. We know that. Otherwise, we would have a much longer list from an enforcement standpoint
Right.
on there with that. We think we try to kind of keep, if everybody behaves themselves,
Yeah.
hopefully keep that in there. There's broader concerns we're trying to address. Obviously, neighbors in some areas especially are concerned about, entire blocks being taken up by short-term rentals, and what does that do to the character of the neighborhood. Zoning does not focus on ownership, for rent, for sale, all those kind of things. Those are things we don't talk about. We talk about the use of property.
Right,
And
right.
so that's what we have to focus on that conversation.
So we mentioned transferring the property, because oftentimes these places are cash flowing and they're maybe an investor or somebody wants to move away. And so it's sold with that permit. And that's why my question was there.
Yeah, now you will be required within, I think, 30 days to tell the city when something's changed.
Of the transfer.
Because what we also don't happen is we call up, there's an
Somebody
issue,
previous owner.
and
Yeah.
it's like, oh, hey, I haven't had that property for 2 years. I'm like, okay, that's a problem.
Yeah,
And that could be grounds for revoking the permit if you don't update the city about that.
got it, understood. So that's actually a good note for any agent that is selling a property that is specifically in use for an Airbnb,
Right.
and that intention is to continue to use it. Now, here's my question, devil's advocate. You mentioned public hearing, you mentioned neighbors. What if I'm a neighbor and I know that you want to run or rent your basement or have a short term in your home, and I don't want you to do that? So I go and get a permit before you to stop you from doing that, because knowing now the 750 rule, if I have one, you can't do it.
Mhm.
How are you policing that they actually use their permit? Or do they even have to use their permit?
They realistically don't have to use their permit. We will be continually tracking activity. So I think if someone comes in and says effectively the use does not exist at this property, we can go back and start asking those questions about there and
Right.
to see if the permit needs to remain active or not on there. We can't permit based on what somebody's intentions might be.
For sure.
It's the same kind of conversation about, we can't dictate that you must build this building in a certain amount of time. We'll approve your plans and say, the plans are good for a certain period of time, but we're not gonna make you build that building tomorrow if you have financing issues or whatever else on there with that. So it's the same philosophy that, we actually heard that from a couple of different folks, and it's a possibility.
Right.
But there's no way for the city to be able to make a distinction on that. If it's one of those things that it's 12 months from now or something, and somebody says, they're not using it for this purpose, it's really more of this use on there, we might go back and look at that question and see if that permit needs to stay valid or not. But in terms of some kind of preemptive, we're not going to be able to.
Yeah,
do
right.
anything.
And then my last question, areas of gentrification. We've got outlying areas that might be an old rundown mill or an old warehouse that we have an investor that's the only person that can afford to truly make this area come alive. would that be can we put in a variance situation, or would that just be a hard no?
Well, a variance sometimes comes from a no. I mean, it's an
Right.
administrative decision, and then the variance says, okay, we don't want this specific one to apply. So, I mean, the short-term rental has to be in something that is a dwelling unit
Right.
on there. So this is not designed for hotels to rent out and do other things on there. I want to be clear about that too. It's not a true full commercial use.
Okay.
It is a limited commercial use within a residential setting, effectively, is what we're dealing with on there. So I think, those unique circumstances might cause those questions to come up, and the variance maybe is the best option on there. We'd probably have to cross that bridge when we come to it, honestly.
Yeah, I lied. One more. Because this is actually something that happens in larger cities like Charlotte. Hotels do list their rooms on Airbnb.
Right.
What's the rule around that here?
Well, it's not going to be subject to a short-term rental regulation.
Okay.
So basically what they're going to say is that's a hotel use, it's a commercial use, is it in commercial zoning, is it acting appropriately based upon building code, fire code, et cetera, for a hotel.
Okay.
So
even posted on Airbnb.
right, so just
They
by
would
the fact
be-
that you post it somewhere does not mean it's a short-term
Understood.
rental on there
By
with
definition.
that. And interesting enough, you mentioned that we were looking at some of the data yesterday, and there are some listings out there where some of the conference resort places and others are using that because they can get eyeballs that way, but it's
Right.
still a hotel, conference center, retreat, whatever it is. It's not a short-term rental.
Understood.
So they would not be able to kind of, eat up that geography, if you will, to prevent others, because that's a hotel. That doesn't count.
I think the information you shared is important for all of us to know, because regardless if we live here, invest here, want to invest here, we need to know how we can take those steps, especially when buying and selling real estate. We'll link you guys' website. 4/1 is the go live date that we're approaching on rather
Yes,
quickly.
very quickly, yes.
At this point, we have less than 2
Less than
months.
months, mhm.
So I wish you the best of luck with that.
Thank you.
And any other updates, as this comes down the pipe, anything we can do to help get that message out, I think is going to help everybody. So-
Right, and I will say, if people have general inquiries just about, the zoning for a property or other things on there, we have what we call planner of the day, which is basically a desk and a phone that somebody rotates throughout the week. We have probably 6 or 7 different planners that do that. 336-373-4340 is that number. That's a good point to start with as far as just getting some general information. If you're not clear about those things, if they can't answer the question, then I will get involved, or somebody else can then follow up and do those things. Thank you. Have patience with us. This is a work in progress.
I would not want to
No
trade
city has figured
positions.
this out. Greensboro is trying to, adopt rules that make sense for Greensboro. We're not a resort town like you might have in Asheville or Wilmington necessarily, but there's definitely a good bit of demand for a lot of different reasons. You touched on that earlier on there. So this is at least a starting point to start to figure this out. And I really think the goal again of the city is that we need to identify where the short-term rentals are through the zoning permit, because we don't have that information now. And then we need to have a responsible party that's there, that if an issue comes up, it's not just the city trying to address those issues. And we need to give people the opportunity, especially when, the city facilities aren't open usually on there, to have somewhere to go to ask those questions and to get that information on there. And that's why we hired that third-party vendor. There are several companies basically across the nation that this is their thing, that they do this. And it's pretty popular, and so we're doing the best we can.
Yeah, well, good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you.